Thank you, Tom, for being here with us tonight at our second Bee Talks. Everybody, thank you for joining us here live. And Tom, you're best known for your work with the bees, and now since tonight also for Zoom technicalities. But I'll keep it very short and hand it over to you so we can get started. And then I'd suggest then at the end of the talk, we leave it open if it's okay for you for some Q&A.
Yes, that'll be fine. Yep, that's often the most informative part of a talk.
Absolutely. So a big applause for Tom Seeley. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for asking me to join you and share a bit of the knowledge I have about honeybees. You can see, this is my opening slide. You can see the title of the talk, probably knew that already, The Dance Language of Bees, How Carl von Frisch Deciphered the Waggle Dance. And it's a rich story, and I've set just 3 goals tonight. First, to understand the form of the waggle dance and the way that worker bees encode information about a food source location or locations in their dances. Secondly, to understand how this unique, and I've emphasized unique form of animal communication was deciphered by Carl von Frisch. It took him many decades to do it. You'll see why. And then thirdly, I want to raise awareness of the behavioral sophistication of worker bees. A worker bee is one of nature's little wonders. It is probably, and I'll explain that, it is without doubt the most intelligent of all of the insects, the worker honeybee. Okay. Let's start by looking together at a bee performing the waggle dance. Now, the waggle dance you're going to see here is a bee doing a waggle dance on the side of a swarm. And I use this waggle dancer because she was out in the open. Easy to video record her. There she is. Waggles, stops, comes around, waggles, stops, turns the other way, waggles, turns to the left, waggles, turns to the right, and so on, so forth. So that's, if we were in the same room, I'd say, how many people have watched a waggle dance? But since we're not, we'll just pass on that. Now, I want to introduce 2 key terms that are essential to this talk. One is the 2 terms that describe the different parts of a circuit of a waggle dance. Each waggle dance has a waggle portion or waggle run to it. And then there's a return run, so the bee gets back to the starting point. Oops. And so those are 2 key terms. We'll be using those terms a lot, often. And beekeepers had seen this behavior for centuries before Carl von Frisch deciphered it. And here's a quote from back in 1823, basically a century before Carl von Frisch worked on the topic. He wrote this nice description. He says, "To many it will seem ridiculous or even incredible if I mention that bees too indulge in certain pleasures and jollity, and that at times they even set about a certain dance after their fashion. What this dance really means, I cannot yet comprehend." Indeed, nobody comprehended it for about 100 years. And even, as we'll see, even Carl von Frisch didn't comprehend it initially. Well, let's review how this waggle dance signaling system works. We're going to start with a situation of a bee that's living, whose home is in this hollow tree here. And she's going out to a patch of flowers. She's found that that's a good patch of flowers. She can get a lot of nectar or pollen or both at that point. And then she comes home and she wants to tell the other bees the location of this patch of flowers. Well, in her dance, and she does that indicating with the waggle dance, and as she does her waggle dance, she does it on the side of a vertical comb, and she has noted the angle between the direction of the sun and the direction at which she flew to get out to the flowers. And that's 40 degrees in this example. So in the hive, where she can't see the sun, she she uses straight up as her reference direction. It's as if she imagines the sun is straight up. And then as she does the waggling portion of the dance, she orients herself that moves along at 40 degrees to the right of straight up, just like the flowers are 40 degrees to the right of the direction of the sun. And then the other thing so that's how she indicates the direction. The way she indicates the target's distance is by adjusting the duration of the waggle run. The greater the distance to a food source, the greater the duration of the waggle run. And this chart shows that bees can communicate out to 5,000 meters. That's more than 3 miles. And the greatest distance I've seen bees use the waggle dance to advertise food sources is about 5 miles. Some investigators in Europe have seen it out to 10 miles. So it's a very powerful communication system, works over a very wide range. And the coding so just to summarize, angle of the waggling indicates direction relative to the sun, and the duration of the waggle run indicates the distance to the target. Now, one thing that I do really want to emphasize is there's only two animals that can tell others about a useful location without leading them to the site or marking a trail to it. And those two animals are human beings and honeybees. And it's a remarkable thing that there are no other animals besides us and honeybees that have this ability, but that is the reality. And it's part of why this waggle dance um, has been so fascinating for us. And as I mentioned earlier, you can think of a worker bee's waggle dance as a miniaturized reenactment of her flight to a place of interest. It can be a water source, it can be a nectar source, it can be a pollen source, it can even be a resin source. But whatever the target is, she uses this same dance to indicate the location. And as I say, it's a miniaturized reenactment in the sense that she adopts the angle that matches the angle of her flight, and she adjusts the duration of the waggle in correspondence with the distance to the target. Now, I want to give you some practice in interpreting a bee's waggle dance. So I'm going to play this video again. Okay, here she is. She's waggling, waggling. And you can see when she does her waggles, she consistently points basically to the left of straight up. Remember, straight up is her reference direction, relative. And you can see that she does a waggle that lasts about 0.8 of a second, not a real long one. So I'm going to ask you now a couple of questions about this bee's dance. Let's assume it's the morning and the sun's direction is due east. Now, in what direction are the flowers being advertised by the dancing bee in the video? And remember, and I'll repeat, she's dancing 90 degrees to the left of straight up, and the sun is in the east. So what's the direction of the patch of flowers?
I'm going to say north.
You're right. You are right. It is north. Oops. Let's do it on here. Yes, the sun's in the east. Over here, she danced 90 degrees to the left of straight up, and that brings us over to the direction of north, because north is 90 degrees to the left of the sun's direction. Very good. Okay. Now, that's not so obvious. I mean, if many beekeepers had seen bees doing this dance, doing the waggle dance, and it was not at all obvious that the bee was indicating a direction and a distance. So how on earth was this eye-catching behavior decoded? And it wasn't easy. It came in stages. Well, in principle, whenever a human being wants to decode the message of a signal produced by some other creature other than a human being, we have to identify a specific context in which the signal is produced. Like, let's say, imagine, for example, imagine you were a Martian and you came down to planet Earth and you saw people in these little metal boxes that had wheels on the bottom. And whenever one of those little metal boxes with wheels with the earthlings inside it came up to a thing that looks like this, they would they wouldn't they would the little car, you might call it, stopped moving. And so that Martian could figure out, oh, that sign is a stop sign. The information that's in that sign is it's a signal to stop at this sign. So that's what Carl von Frisch had to do. So he knew what the signal was. It was like he knew what the stop sign was, but he was like the Martian, looking down at people. In his case, looking down at the bees, trying to figure out, well, what's this? What's that signal mean? And he had to find the context in which that signal is produced. And as we all know it, stop signs are produced at the corners of intersections. This is just repeating what I just said. One needs to identify a consistent context of signal production. And in this stop sign, that consistent context is, this is a place where a person needs to pause and look around. And I'll come back to this quote from this gentleman, Unhoch. It'll seem ridiculous or even incredible. Bees indulge in a certain pleasures and jolly. What this dance really means, I cannot yet comprehend. Because he didn't know the context in which the bees were producing this dance. He didn't know what the dancing bee had experienced, which stimulated her to do a waggle dance. So what's the message of the waggle dance? Someone needed to find a consistent context in which bees produce this signal. And Carl von Frisch did so. And he discovered this context when he was studying bee color vision. Many people, believe that bees had color vision. Otherwise, why would flowers have all these beautiful colors? But it's one thing to think it, and it's another thing to have evidence that they really have color vision. So back in the 1910s, when he was a young professor, he was studying color vision. And here's just a couple of pictures, a little deeper introduction to the gentleman. He was an Austrian zoologist, born in 1886, died in 1982. He was the youngest of four brothers. Here he is, little Karlchen. And here he was as a young professor at the age at which he deciphered the waggle dance, age 26 years old. And here he is as an elderly gentleman. He was Austrian, so he's got some nice lederhosen trousers here, and he's tending a little dish of food that is being visited by honeybees. Now, he got into studying the bees' dances, as I mentioned earlier, when he was doing tests for color vision. This was back in the 1910s. And the way he would test bees for color vision is he would train the bees from a hive to come and collect sugar solution from a little vessel that sat on top a colored board. In this case, it's yellow, but my example over here will refer to a blue. Imagine this yellow board is blue. So what he would do is he would put this little board with a dish of food right at the entrance of the hive, and then once a few bees found it and were drinking from it, he'd move it a little farther away from the hive. So that would be and then he'd eventually get it out maybe 10 or 20 meters out. And that's the training process, introducing bees to the feeder. And then to test whether the bees had color vision, he would take away this contraption and he'd replace it with this checkerboard. And you can see this checkerboard has 16 squares. Only one of them has a color, and it would have and this blue color for this test matched the color under the feeder. Unfortunately, I have a yellow board under when I took this photograph, but imagine there was a blue board underneath this feeder. So he put out this checkerboard array, and he put out 16 empty dishes, one on each of the squares, and the other squares are all shades of white and black and gray. And if the bees did not have color vision, then they would confuse the blue square with one of the other squares. But if they do have color vision, the bees will crowd on the blue square. And as you can see from this drawing, the bees crowded on the blue square. The, so that was very good evidence that the bees have color vision. So that's what he was doing. He was back in the 1910s, he was he wasn't studying their bees' communication, he was studying their sensory abilities, color vision especially. But what led him into looking at the bees' communication about communication abilities with respect to food sources was when he was training bees to come to his feeder. And what he would do is he would have had a colony of bees in the courtyard, as I'll show you in a bit. And sometimes he would leave the feeder empty for several hours or overnight. And of course, the bees would stop visiting it. And then eventually he would refill it the next morning or maybe in the afternoon after he'd had a lunch break. And what he observed was something that really um, made him very curious about these bees. What he saw and what he found was that after one bee revisited the refilled feeder, loaded up, and then went home, it was not long before other bees began to arrive. In other words, he might have sat there. This little dish of food might sit there for an hour empty, but because it was a time the bees weren't used to finding food at the feeder. But as soon as one little curious little bee came out and found it and discovered that it was full again, soon it wasn't long before other bees began to arrive at the feeder. This told him that somehow that bee had shared the news of her discovery. And he wondered, how did she do this? Pretty good. It was a good mystery, wasn't it? Well, at this point, Carvin Frisch realized he needed to see what the first bee that came back from that feeding dish, what that bee did when she got back into her hive. And initially, he was just working with a conventional beekeeper's hive at the Zoological Institute. But then he had a carpenter build for him an observation hive. And um, what I'm showing here is one of the observation hives that I use. When I teach a course in animal behavior, the students have a laboratory where they have to come in and choose a behavior of the bees and then carefully describe it and explain what it is, how it's produced, and why it's produced, and so forth. And my hives are mounted. They're two frames. You can see it's just two frames, one atop the other. And the bees come and go from these hives through these long tunnels. I had to build long tunnels to get the hive so the bees could get over to the window. So Von Frisch had this, but he started out with a single frame hive. And he provided a sugar water feeder just outside his hive. And he had his hive was also inside the laboratory building where he was. He provided a sugar water feeder just outside the hive, just outside the window where the hive was. And he labeled the first bee to visit the feeder. And then he did the obvious thing. He watched to see what this bee did when she came into the observation hive. And here's what he wrote. I could scarcely believe my eyes. She performed a dance on the honeycomb, which greatly excited the marked foragers around her and caused them to fly back to the feeding place. This, I believe, was the most far-reaching observation of my life. And this is the drawing of the dances of the bees that he saw that were advertising the feeder near the hive. As I say, it was maybe just a yard away from the entrance of his observation hive. And he called this the round dance. And you can see why, because the bee runs around in a circle. There's no clear waggle to it. It just looks like she's running around and then she turns around and goes around the other way. So he called that the round dance or the der Rundtanz. And Von Frisch asked himself, well, what's the message of this dance? And his initial answer was just this: alert, there's now rich food available outside the hive. And that was a very plausible interpretation of the dance, because other bees followed, the bees that followed closely after the bee doing the round dance, they scurried right out of the hive and would show up at the feeder. Now I want to explain, I need to explain where Carl von Frisch conducted his initial studies of how the bees share information about food sources. This is a picture of Carl von Frisch. I went to the Austrian archives um, in a museum there, and they had just one photo of Carl von Frisch as a young man. A lot of photos when he became famous, but just this one when he was a young professor. And it's the photo was taken. What he was doing when this photo was taken, he was doing his studies of the bees' um, olfactory discrimination abilities. He had put out these little boxes with different scents in them, and only one of them had food in them. And then he could shuffle the boxes around so that you could test whether the bees could discriminate the box in which they had found food from the other boxes. And of course they do. That's one. No surprise there. So this courtyard was of the Zoological Institute, which is near the center of Munich. And the reason I'm explaining this is because it's important to understand what he did in the context of the situation in which he was working. So, as I say, this building was in the center of Munich. There are not many flowers in Munich, and so he would see bees. Let's see, and when he looked in the observation hive, he saw returning foragers performing two kinds of dances. One was the round dance, which he had seen performed by the bees coming back from his little nearby sugar water feeder. And then he also saw bees doing what he called the tail wagging dance, or we call the waggle dance. So he saw these as two very different forms of dance behavior. And these, by the way, are the original drawings in his first report on these dances, these nice little hand-drawn little pen and ink sketches of bees. So he thought there were two distinct dances, a round dance and a tail wagging or waggle dance. I'll keep using the name waggle dance. And this was his interpretation. The round dance has a message, alert, nectar is available. And the waggle dance, he thought, it had this message, alert, pollen is available, because he never saw bees coming in doing round dances with pollen, but he often saw bees coming in that were doing dances and bearing pollen. And of course, he didn't see every bee. Not every bee doing a waggle dance had pollen on her legs, but he thought, well, okay, those bees that are dancing that don't have pollen, it's probably because they'd already kicked off the pollen before they did the dance. So he he got a little mixed up here on this. He should have looked a little more closely, perhaps. So he initially thought round dance meant nectar is available. Waggle dance was just a signal that pollen's available, and whatever when bees should go out of the hive and go search for the nectar and the pollen that's available. And as I mentioned, the problem was his sugar water feeder was in the Zoological Institute's courtyard. The pollen-bearing flowers were in gardens throughout Munich. That's why, so the bees coming from his feeder were coming back from a very nearby feeder. Bees from going to the gardens were coming back from more distant locations. Hence, they were doing a different kind of dance. But as I mentioned, he was wrong. It wasn't that the round dance says nectar's available and the waggle dance says pollen's available. No. What was correct was the message of this dance, as we all know now, is alert. Food is available nearby, less than 150 feet from the hive, in fact. And what we now know too is the waggle dance also says alert, food is available, but the food is available far away, more than 150 meters from the hive. And as we all know, the waggle dance can advertise a food source miles from the hive. But it took von Frisch a while to figure this out. And as I mentioned, the source of von Frisch's mistake was he unintentionally created a correlation between food type and food distance. Sugar water from nearby feeder, pollen from distant flowers, unintentionally. So back in the mid-1910s, Carl von Frisch had two misunderstandings about the bees' dances. He underestimated their information content. He didn't know that they present information about direction and distance. And he misinterpreted the information content of round versus waggle dance. He thought that they indicated food type instead of food location. Again, round dance he thought meant, oh, there's pollen available. Waggle dance he thought was nectar is available. So how did he get? He's a lucky man because he got to correct himself. So how and when did Carl Frisch correct his misunderstanding about the bees' dances? Well, he did this in 19 summers of 1944 and 1945, right near the end of World War II. And the context was, first of all, Munich was heavily by 1944 and 1945, Allied bombers were able to freely fly over Germany, pretty freely fly over them, and hit the major cities with bombs. And um, Von Frisch's Zoological Institute, of which he was the director, was not far from the main primary railroad station in Munich. And so the bombers weren't perfectly precise. And so a lot of bombs hit the Zoological Institute. And so by the summer of 44, he couldn't stay in Munich. Um, he went to his down to his summer home, which is in the Austrian Alps, safe and peaceful. And here's where he made his key discoveries. It's a little town called Brunwinkel. That means spring corner. This is a typical house in this part of the world, Austrian Alps. Pretty neat, huh? And with him was a colleague, Dr. Ruth Beutler. And her specialty was studying the odor discrimination abilities of worker bees. She was fascinated by the olfactory powers of worker bees. And she was doing an experiment. She was doing experiments where bees were living in a hive. It wasn't an observation, it was just a hive. And she would train them out to a dish of food, and she would put a particular scent in the food. And then she would test the bees to see how well she could then put out multiple dishes around nearby and test whether the other dishes would have something other than lavender. They might have the scent of anise or something else, or peppermint. And then she could test how well they could discriminate the lavender from the other scents. So she would train bees out to a feeding station and train. So some bees were coming to that station, getting food, bringing back some of the scent on their bodies and so forth. But after a while, she got weary of walking 1,000 feet to get to the sugar water feeder, and she wanted to set up her feeder closer to the hive. So she went and asked Carl Frisch, "What should I do? What should I need to do to move my feeder in closer to the hive?" And von Frisch gave her some advice, which turned out to be, and the advice was, set up an identical feeder near the hive um, with the same scent, but just near the hive. Carl Frisch thought that the 5 lavender-scented bees would perform dances that would arouse other bees to leave and search for a lavender-scented food source, and so would quickly find the nearby feeder. Because after all, it was only 30 feet from the hive, where it wouldn't be hard to find. So she did this. But what happened? Well, what she found was that because she had left the old feeder set up, because that was the scent source, that's where the bees were going. Those are the bees who were carrying back the scent to the hive. But even though there was this feeder here, which was very attractive food, only 2 recruits showed up here, 20. So showed up still at this distant feeder. Even though, you would think if the bees were just going out and searching without knowing where they were looking, just knowing that they're looking for the source of the food with the right scent, you'd think many more would find it they would find it more easily at the feeder that's only 30 feet from the hive than the one that's 1,000 feet from the hive. So they were all puzzled. Why did more recruits arrive at the distant feeder? Was there something in the dance that was telling bees to go out a great distance? And that was the key point in their analysis. And the way Carvin Prish put it, he says, he wondered, did the bees have a word for distance in their dance? And so he did this experiment. He put out two food sources, one 10 meters, the other 250. He had 5 bees trained to bring back food from each feeder, no more, no fewer, no less. So 5 blue dot bees, 5 red dot bees. And then he watched, and so he had bees bringing back, red dot bees were coming back and doing dances from a distant feeder. Blue dot bees were coming back and doing dances in the hive from the nearby feeder. And here's what he saw. He saw the blue dot bees were doing round dances, and the red dot bees were doing waggle dances. And he wrote in one of his books, he wrote, it was like the scales fell from his eyes, as if he had vision problems. And now he could see, oh yeah, these two dances, they're both recruitment dances, but it's a matter of distance. The difference is this advertises a nearby source, this a more distant source. It's not that this one advertises pollen, this one advertises nectar. I bet Carvin Fish thought, ah, German for wow. Ooh, I get it now. And so he understood the message of the dance is alert, desirable foods available at a certain angle relative to the sun's direction and a certain distance from the hive. That took a lot of insight to realize, and I don't have time to go and explain how he kind of figured that out, but he noticed that during the day, if he had as the sun moved, the direction which the bees oriented their waggle runs moved, and that gave him the clue that it was the sun was involved. Then he finally realized it was straight up meant towards the sun and so forth. And then he carefully trained bees out to different distances and measured the duration of the waggle run in the dances of the bees at each distance. And he learned that the duration of the waggle run indicates distance. Great progress. And another thing that he did is he wanted to figure out, well, okay, this is a remarkable communication behavior, but I wonder how well it really works. How well do the dance followers use the information in a waggle dance? In other words, how precise is the communication? So in the 1950s, once Germany was getting itself back on its feet, and Karl von Frisch at this point had a very nice two-tone Volkswagen Bug, but that was very special at that time. And he went out into a forest near Munich, and they did an experiment. It's called the fan experiment, where they would have the hive. One hive was put here, and then they put out, and the bees were trained to a feeder in the center of this fan-shaped array. So there's only at one of these locations was there a feeder. And then they would put out scented plates at all these other places nearby in this array. And the scent of on these plates would be the same scent as the food that was being collected by the bees coming back from the feeder. That same scent that was in the food was put at all the scented plates. So fan experiment with 7 scented plates. And the question was, well, how well do the bees use the information? How well do they use the direction information in particular for this experiment? And the results are shown, let's see, I think the results are shown here. These little numbers, which might be a little hard to read, indicate how many recruits came to each of these stations over, I think, an hour-long period. 42 showed up at the scented plate in the direction of the feeder. Only 5 showed up at an angle to the feeder. 5, 2, 1, 1, or 5, 3, 0. So yeah, it was very clear. These bees the bees that had followed the dances, they knew the direction with pretty good precision. But there was one mistake. There was one error that Carvin Frisch kept making to the rest of his life, and it has to do with the way he studied these dances. He kept making the mistake of thinking that there are 2 discrete dances, round dances and waggle dances. And he even described these 2 forms as 2 separate words in the dance language. And the reason he thought they were distinct is, or the messages, he thought they had distinct messages. He thought the round dance said, food is nearby, direction unspecified. The waggle dance says food is far, direction specified. But we now know that the round dance and the waggle dance, this distinction is artificial. I mean, they do look different, but they don't have different functions. These are not two discrete, functionally discrete dances. They're both recruitment dances to food sources. And we know this from one of the experiments that I did, where I had trained bees out to feeding stations. And when I would, here's the layout of the experiment. If I put the hive is here, and I put up two little feeding stations. One, oops. One of them has food, one doesn't. And if I set the feeding stations only 30 feet from the hive, then the bees they do round dances, and they don't point the direction very clearly at all because they're just saying there's some food nearby. And so you can see the distribution of the waggle run directions when the food is at 10 meters. They point in lots of different directions. If they were all pointing precisely straight up, or straight up means the direction to the feeder with the food. But at 10 meters, it's very noisy. They're not very precise. But but there is usable information in there, and that's indicated by the fact that actually, even though it's very noisy, 70% of the bees went to the feeder that had the food, and only 30% went to the feeder without the food. Now, when we repeated the experiment at a greater distance, at 50 meters, well, now the bees, of course, do a much more precise indication of the direction because it's a lot farther from the hive. And when we did and this is the outcome of the experiment. 100% of the bees would go in the direction of the feeder that had the food. And so these numbers up here, I should have said, are percentages. 70% went here, but 30% went over there. At greater distance, it's 100% versus 0%. So they're not two discrete types of dance. All these dances, whether it's a round dance or a waggle dance, contains usable direction information. It's just that these dances give the directional information more precisely. And yeah, this is just a plot that shows how this waggle phase duration just gets longer and longer with the distance to the food source. And the longer the waggle phase duration, the more precisely the bees can get the information about the direction to the food. So there are four main take-home lessons from this talk and from Von Frisch's experiments. We've learned about how information about distance and direction are encoded in waggle dances. Directions indicated by the orientation of the waggle run relative to straight up on the comb. Distance is indicated by the duration of the waggle run in each dance circuit. The second lesson is that it can be really hard to decode the signals of other species because to know what a signal means, you have to know exactly what that animal was experiencing and that caused it to produce the signal. And if you're a bird watcher, you'll know that if you hear an alarm call, you know that probably that little bird might have spotted an owl or something nearby. But it's that kind of analysis. So it can be hard, as we saw with this analyzing the waggle dance, that it decode the signals of the bees. And I think the third take-home message is that I hope this will cause you to recalibrate your expectations about animal behavior. A worker bee's brain is very sophisticated, even though it's very small. Now, if any of you is an owner of a dog, that you won't need a recalibration, I'm sure, of your expectations about animal braininess and behavior. You probably, if you're a dog owner, as I am, you know that your little friend, your furry friend, is always thinking about this or that. And I guess the fourth take-home message is this. even Nobel Prize winners don't always get things right on the first try. So, if you're running into a problem and you can't solve it right away, keep trying. At least that's the lesson I've learned. And at this point, I will just bring us back to Carl von Frisch and his nice two-tone Volkswagen Bug from the early 1950s and ask if there are questions. And if there are, I'll do my best to answer them.
Yes. Has it ever been determined how many colors a honeybee can actually see? Or is there any guesstimation to that? Are there colors that they just miss? I guess would be sort of the question I'm asking.
I think their range of discrimination of colors is as good as ours. It's just that they don't see the colors that are down towards the red part of the spectrum. They do see orange because there's some yellow in orange, and then they see yellow and green, blue, and indigo, and they also see ultraviolet. So they have basically the same range as us, but they see into the ultraviolet. They don't see down to the red, and they discriminate. They're very good at discriminating between those different shades of green or different shades of blue or different shades of violet because the colors of the flowers vary considerably, and they really want to lock in on learning and memorizing how to recognize flowers that are really rewarding. So their color vision is very, very good, and it's a lot like ours. It's a trichromatic system like our eyes. They can discriminate colors really well if you have three kinds of color receptors. Both they have that and we have that. So when you paint your hives, yeah, you can just keep in mind that if you paint them red, that won't be distinct from a black.
One question for you, Tom, because the thing I picked up from what you said is that apparently you can train bees. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh yeah, I should have explained that. Thanks for asking that. The way you train bees, and when I say train bees, it's training them to forage at a particular location. What you do is you get a little square of used comb, old comb. You fill it up with sugar solution, or I should say sugar syrup. The thicker, the better. You put it right at the entrance of the hive. And so sooner or later, some foragers are going to walk onto it, realize, wow, there's a gold mine right here on this comb. And they lock in on that comb. And then once you can put some paint dots on them so you can tell when they come back. When you've got bees coming back to your little square of comb, and when I say a little square, maybe 2 inches by 2 inches, then you can lift the comb off the landing board of the hive and put it on, a cement block or a little table or some portable surface that you can move. And ideally might have some colors associated with it so it looks a little bit like a patch of flowers. You might move it at first 6 feet. And then once bees are going back and forth between that, the feeder at 6 feet from the hive, then you can move it to 12 feet. And once they're happy going back and forth to the feeder when it's 12 feet from the hive, then you move it to 24 feet, and then 48 feet, and then 96 feet. And so you can just keep moving it out step by step. But you have to be, whether you can do it or not, whether that works or not, depends a lot on whether there's a nectar flow on. If there's a nectar flow on, the bees are not interested in going to a weirdo artificial food source because these artificial food sources, I think, to them it's like robbing. They come up to a place, they come up to a comb or something like that, and there's food that's just can be taken right away. Well, the only way that ever happens in nature is when there's robbing, and robbing to bees is dangerous work. So I don't think they like, only when they're really pretty hungry for forage can they be trained. But that's the training procedure. So step 1 is to find a time when there's a nectar dearth on. Step 2 is to get an old piece of comb. Step 3, mix up some sugar syrup, put some in the comb, put it at the entrance of a hive, and then once bees are showing interest in it, move it out step by step.
Anybody else? Hold on.
I know that there are different types of bees. So do they all do dances, or is it just some? some species, subtypes of bees that do dances?
The only bees that do the waggle dances, the very sophisticated communication of the waggle dance, the only bees that do that are honeybees. Now there is more than one species of honeybee. If you go to Asia, I think you'll find 9 other species of honeybees, and they all have the waggle dance. But no bees other than honeybees have the waggle dance, perform the waggle dance. And that's part of why it's so special, I guess you might say. Yeah. Can,
You,
can,
yeah.
can I ask you this question? How many people have in your audience have seen bees doing waggle dances? Yeah. Yep.
80% of us.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Well, the next time you're working your bees and you pull out a comb gently so it's not too disturbing, uh, if it's a comb from the bottom box down near the entrance, and it's a day of nice weather, you'll probably see bees doing these waggle dances. And it's fun to watch them for sure.
If you really want to test it, you try and find the food source yourself.
And there have been times when we've been doing experiments where we needed to do exactly that. We
Wow.
some a lot of times I go up to this place in the North Woods in New York State to get away from flowers, so the bees are desperate. But every once in a while, those bees, and so they will come to my sugar water feeders, but every once in a while, some bee has found some flowers, and it might be 5, it might be 8 miles away. And I'm always curious to figure out what's out there. What is that bee doing? What has she found? What on earth has she found? And so I'll carefully read the dance. I'll get really good readings on the direction and the distance. And then I'll go out. I'll figure out some way to get out to that spot. And the last time I did this, I found that there had been a logging operation up in this heavily forested area a year or two before, and the place was full of blackberry plants in bloom. And the bees, one little scout bee had found this thing. Can't remember how many miles away, but a scout bee had gone out, found that patch of blackberry plants in bloom, came back, and evidently did a dance. So, and steered a bunch of her fellow foragers to it. So, I don't know how I got into that, but that's a classic situation of where they make good use of the waggle dance. Not much food, but when they find some, they can really capitalize on it. Can I ask you another question? Has anybody in the audience driven one of these old Volkswagen Beetles? I never have. I wonder what it's like. I bet they're pretty flimsy.
Funny enough, my brother was obsessed with them, and he owned about 3 of them over the course of his life.
Convertible one?
So I've driven in one in the passenger seat, but I've never actually drove it myself.
Yeah.
So not a convertible, no, all hard shell.
Yep.
So my brother had I think it was a 72. It was a automatic stick shift. So it was a stick shift, but there was no clutch, which is kind of weird. I drove it too.
That sounds like German engineering, doesn't it?
It's best.
Good.
The waggle dance, if there's all these bees doing waggle dances, like which bees follow them to which locations? It's like how many, like, oh, there's one bee doing this waggle dance. How many of those, and is it just because they're in the vicinity of that bee that they go out to the, it's very fascinating.
That's you put your finger on an interesting issue about which is we'll switch our focus, our attention from the bees producing the dance to the bees that follow a waggle dance. And just as you say, there can be, 10, 15 bees doing waggle dances simultaneously in a strong colony's hive. And so what we've learned is that the bees that are looking for work, the unemployed foragers, what they do is they don't shop around among those dancers. They just choose one at random and follow it. And that works perfectly because the better the food source, the longer a bee will perform her dance. If it's a really good food source, it can last for 5 minutes. If it's a not a very good food source, it might only last for a half a minute. And so by having the dance followers just choose a dance at random, they automatically distribute them, they automatically allocate themselves to the best food source because that they're most likely to indicate a dance for the richest food source that this fellow foragers have found. There are many questions about how exactly in the dark a bee measures the angle of the dancing bee. We currently think the evidence suggests that in order for a bee that's following a waggle dancer to get a sense of the direction of the waggle run, the angle on the vertical surface, she has to position. She can't see the bee do the waggle dance, but she can hear the bee do the waggle dance. There's a fluttering sound made by her body going back and forth. And if you're a dance follower and you're directly behind the bee, aligned with the bee, that sound won't it will be a pretty even in its volume or its loudness because the bee's going back and forth in front of you. But if you're standing to the side of the bee, the sound will go up and down in its strength or amplitude because sometimes the bee is coming towards you, sometimes it's going away from you. So we think that in the darkness of the hive, that's how they get a sense of if they sense when they are aligned with the waggle dancer as she does her waggle run, and they then sense their own body's angle on the comb surface.
I have one question, and might be a whole different topic of conversation, but how do they determine do they have any certain dance on whether they're going out for pollen? And you talked about earlier in the conversation that they had this thing, we thought it was going out for pollen or nectar. Have they even determined on what type of dances or whatnot on what they're going out for, whether it be water, pollen, propolis? Yeah.
There's sort of two parts, a two-part answer to that question. The first part is, let me think how to say this. We do know that the bees that collect nectar are different it's not the same. If a bee is collecting nectar, she probably will never collect pollen. And if she's collecting pollen or nectar, she'll probably never collect resin. And a resin collector, likewise, will never go out and collect pollen or nectar. The bees specialize on the type of material that they collect. And what stimulates a bee to go out and look for a good source of whatever she wants, whether she's seeking nectar or seeking pollen or propolis, resin, or water. That depends on her ability to sense the colony's need for water or nectar or pollen or resin. And for example, let's focus on resin. I know, at least in where I live, the bees don't collect much resin until August and September. It's when the nights start to get cool. And if they feel drafts and it's cool air coming in, then they will somehow, that tells the bees that are prone to collect resin to in fact go out and get resin. With respect to pollen, it's a similar situation, or I should say water, it's a similar situation. The water collectors are specialist collectors, but a colony doesn't always need water. But it does need water on really hot days. And that's when somehow those bees sense, maybe they're feeling the overheating, we don't really know. But if it gets hot in a hive, the water collectors, they activate themselves. Likewise, with respect to the pollen, after several days of bad weather, the colony will have consumed all of its pollen. And if it's rearing a lot of brood, the bees will some the pollen forager will somehow start to feel pollen hungry, I suppose you might say, and then they go out. And the bees that collect nectar, they they will go out almost any day as long as it's good weather, because they know, in a sense, they know that the colony always needs more nectar. Thank you for asking that question. It's a key part of the organization of the foraging and the collecting of a honeybee colony. Different groups, each one sensing the need of its material.
So, Tom, I have another question too. So, when a bee is in a swarm and there's a waggle dance on the swarm, is it the same exact method to find the new home?
It is, yeah. The signaling works the same way. The only thing that's a little different is that, well, let's talk a little bit about this. Yes, bees will perform waggle dances on the vertical curtain or side of a swarm. So straight up is indicating a potential home site in the direction of the sun. And straight down would mean, oh, go look for this site that I found that was directly away from the direction of the sun. So the way the direction and distance are indicated is the same. But there's a difference between the dances done by nest site scouts and waggle dancer and foragers. For one thing, the dances by nest site scouts, um, they have a very wide range. If the site is wonderful, the bee might do 300 dance circuits. If it's only so-so, she might only do 40 dance circuits or 10 dance circuits. So in that regard, it's a lot like the nectar foragers and the pollen foragers. If the nectar's really good, source is really good, she'll do more dance circuits. But there's a difference. If you're a nectar forager, as long as your nectar source is really profitable, you'll dance for it every time you come in the hive. But with the nest site scouts, it's different. It's a nest site scout finds a site, she inspects it for about 30 minutes, and then it's like she grades it on a scale of 1 to 100. If it's 100, she'll do a lot of dancing on the first time she comes back to the hive. But then the next time, she does fewer dance circuits. And then the next time gets back to the swarm, she'll do, instead of 100, she does 70, and then 40, and then 30, and then none. In other words, they have an automatic process of not continuing to advertise a site. And what that does, and we've looked at this, and I've written about it in this book called Honeybee Democracy. It's a way of helping them make sure they choose the best site, because it means that it kind of keeps keeping the discussion open for a while. And eventually they will reach a decision, because the best site will get the most interest and it will get the most bees visiting it. But they've got this system of doing the dances that prevents them from jumping to a conclusion. They deliberate it. They take time to deliberate. As I say, I'll pitch the book, Honeybee Democracy. It's a great story. Great book.
So do you think that once like they find a water source, say like a bee comes back, found a water source, does a waggle dance, and then a certain number of bees follow them, you were saying that if they're water collectors, they're always going to be water collectors, or if there's pollen collectors, they're always going to be, or nectar collectors, So do you think that group just always goes to the same location, or how do they know that, like, okay, I'm a water collector, so I'm going to always find water? Do they just keep going back and forth to the same water source, do you think?
Yeah. It seems like there's two parts to your question. One is, yeah, once you're a water collector and you know of a good source, yeah, there's no reason for her not to keep going back to that water source. If it's good, but if it works, don't fix it, sort of. The other thing is that the water collectors they turn on and they turn off their activity. They will only keep collecting water when a colony needs it. So it's not like they're like blind. They're not blind to the colony's water need, whether it's high or low. And so, because it's always dangerous to go out. And sometimes water can be a particularly dangerous material to collect if the bee has to collect it on the shore of a lake, for example. Because if a little wave comes in and sweeps over the bee that's standing on a wet rock where she's drinking up water from a film on that rock, she can get stuck in the water. So they only collect water when they really need it. It's funny, isn't it, to think that water's dangerous? Well, if you're a little animal like a bee, getting in the water, you're stuck, is a problem.
Do you think that bees are the most intelligent or animals? Or what is your
Oh, what was the question that the pickup didn't work very well for me?
Do you think bees are one of the most intelligent animals, that there is, based on that they can lead? Well, between us and the bees, we're the only ones who can, right, lead where food or water is, what is quite essential to survive and to prosper.
I would say they're the most intelligent insects. The most intelligent insects. They can't approach what primates can do, but they are the best problem solvers among the insects. They have the most flexible behavior, best learners among the insects. Yeah. And but of course they don't build computers. I mean, they can't do any of the fancy stuff that we can do. They can't drive cars, can't operate a computer.
I know a few people that can't drive cars too.
Wait a minute.
Well, it just goes to show it's not trivial to know how to drive a car. Well, let me see how many people can I ask you a question? How many of you have observed a swarm and seen the bees dancing on the side of the swarm?
Yeah.
Talk about?
Oh, no. I don't want to talk about swarms. Catching swarms, yes, Tom. Catching swarms, though.
Yeah, to be honest, when I see a swarm, it's so exciting that I really don't pay that close attention to them. It's more of how do I get a box and let me collect them, more so than let me stop and relax and look at them. So,
okay, yeah, because I know sometimes you're probably under pressure to get that swarm the heck out of there.
Correct.
Yeah, but if you see a swarm and you've got the time and don't have the time pressure, then it's fun to watch the scout bees doing the dances on the swarm because they can be so excited. I mean, this is life or death for them to get a new home site figured out and move to. So they can be very, very excited dancers. And I think the nest site scouts are they have to do the most complicated job of any bee in the whole colony. They have to go out, find sites. If they find a potential site, they have to come back. They have to inspect it, grade it, and then come back, advertise it, and then once they've advertised it with a dance, then they fly back to the site to mark it with Nasanov pheromone, and then they have to regulate their dancing so they don't keep dancing forever. It's a great those nest site scouts. I admire them greatly.
A lot of confidence and a lot of work. Yeah. Tom, if you don't mind me asking, to go back to colors, is there a specific color that bees prefer over other colors?
Yeah, the color that for a food source, the color that let me think what people have found. Yeah, the colors that I think that are inherently um, the best indicators to a bee that this is a food source are um, blues, violets, and ultraviolets. And
Okay.
and flowers that look white to us, often they're reflecting ultraviolet light. I mean, sunlight has a lot of ultraviolet in it, as we all know. And those white flowers usually don't appear just plain white to a bee. They are usually beaming with ultraviolet, shooting back or reflecting back lots of bright ultraviolet light. The bees' eyes are very sensitive to that, as they are to the blues. Yep.
Oh, very interesting to know. I've got a huge holly bush in front of my house, and every year in the spring, it is covered with all kinds of honeybees and native bees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, wasps even. They love it. And I wonder if it has to do with the white flower or if it's the scent of the bush.
I think it's several things, and I know exactly what you mean. My parents had a holly bush by one of the doors, and yeah, it's, in part of the summer, that place was just alive with worker honeybees. I think it's a combination of things that makes it attractive. One is there's a high density of flowers on holly bushes. Secondly, I think those holly bushes I think they produce nectar very profusely, and it may be very high quality nectar. That would be interesting to do to measure, to investigate, to see if there's an unusually high sugar concentration in the flowers of holly on holly bushes. Yeah, thanks for raising that question. It brings back really fond memories, and it raises a really interesting question. What exactly is it about the holly bushes that make them so attractive?
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time to answer.
Yeah, these are I can tell. Yeah, there's a lot of folks looked at looked at bees in various situations.
Hey, Tom, we need to be mindful about your time, right?
Yeah, let's see. I can go for. I do have to sign off in within 15 minutes. So,
but we got a little fun thing to do for the people right here. We got our specialist here, Stacy, who's going to find an innocent hand to draw one lucky winner of one great author. I wonder who that was again. Tom Seeley, who kindly has offered a book, his latest book, as a gift to this drawing. So get your ticket out.
So Tom, before we do this though, is this a signed book? And if it's not, can we send it back to you and get it signed?
Tom, this is Dwayne. I can send you his cell phone and all details. He's asking if it's a signed book.
Oh yes, it will certainly be signed, certainly. And the title will be, it's my newest book, Piping Hot Bees and Boisterous Buzz Runners, 20 Mysteries of Honeybee Behavior Solved.
Can you briefly elaborate on the book, just for the people who don't know, just a brief?
Yeah, this is a book. This is a book where I wanted to tell short stories about the bees' behaviors. Honeybees have so many different behaviors. There's pollen collecting, there's comb building, there's the waggle dance, there's the tremble dance, there's the shaking signal. There's all of these distinct behaviors. And I didn't want to leave what I and others had learned about these behaviors hidden away in the scientific journals. I wanted to make this information available for beekeepers. And so I wrote this book, and I had actually, when I started writing it, I had a list of 30 behaviors or 35 behaviors I wanted to discuss, present. But the editor said, 20 tops. So it's only got 20 stories, but each one's a good story about solving a mystery. And I think the first one is about how bees avoid asphyxia in their hives. It's about hive or nest ventilation. Next ones are about how they choose a home site, the decision-making process, what they want in a home, things like that. There's other chapters on things like the tremble dance, the shaking signal, the things I've talked about this evening. And a lot about the house hunting process, choosing a new home site. So that's what the book is about. And I'm I want to stress, I wrote this book with beekeepers in mind. It's not for my fellow scientists, it's for my fellow bee lovers. And so I I'll be sending off one to the lucky winner, but it's first you can easily get it on Amazon. It's a good book. I worked about a year and a half on writing it. Worked with a really good artist, so I think if you take a look at it, I think you'll enjoy it.
Thank you again.
Thank you. I think I just bought it on Audible. I'm really excited about it. So the lucky winner is last three digits 163. Oh my gosh.
There we go. Come on forward. Tom, we got a winner.
Good. And who is the winner?
There we go.
What's the name?
Very good.
Hi.
My congratulations.
Thank you
We'll
very
get that
much.
book. Well, now, Bart, let me make sure I got this right. I'm going to mail the book to you, correct?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Okay, great. Righto, I'll get it in the mail tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Tom.
We'll get it to our winner.
And let me just check, Bart. Did I already? I can't keep track of these things. Did I already mail you the book, or if I still need to?
You still need to. That's fine. No.
Okay, make a note. Send book to Bart.
Yeah.
Book to Bart. There we go.
Yes. What's your name again?
Jenny.
Book to Jenny. But no, I'm not going to confuse you, Tom. Book to Bart, and then I'll get it to Jenny. Pardon me.
For Jenny.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. I got a note. My memory doesn't work as well as it used to be, but my notes still work really well. Good. Okay. Thank you, folks. Thanks for your interest. My pleasure to join you.
Have a great night.
Okay.